The year is 1488. A 12-year-old girl stands in the highest tower of Château de Null, the small hands gripping the cold stone windowsill until her knuckles turn white. Below, the banners of enemy armies stretch across the Breton countryside like a plague of locusts. The wind carries the acrid smell of smoke from burning villages. And somewhere in the distance, she can hear the faint clash of steel on steel. This is not how queens are supposed to be made out of. Brittany presses her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watches her world crumble. The weight of a duchy, an entire people rests on shoulders that should be carrying nothing heavier than a child's concerns. But childhood ended for the moment. Her father's labored breathing stopped, echoing through these same stone halls. Now she is Duchess of Brittany, the last hope of a proud Celtic nation. And powerful men across Europe are already deciding her fate. Like merchants haggling over a prize mare, she doesn't know it yet, but she will be forced to marry 3 times. She will endure at least 14 pregnancies, watching child after child slip away like morning mist. She will be passed from one conqueror to another, each marriage a political shackle disguised as a golden crown. This is the story of how a little girl became the most tragic queen in European history, and how she somehow found the strength to fight back. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we re-exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand man's tragedy, you have to understand what Brittany was and what it meant to lose it. Picture a land where ancient Celtic traditions still whispered through oak groves, where the Breton language flowed like honey on the tongues of fishermen and farmers, where proud dukes had ruled independently for centuries, while the rest of Europe shifted like sand around them. Brittany was the last free Celtic nation, a stubborn thorn in the side of an expanding French kingdom. When Anne's father, Duke Francis II, died in 1488, he left behind no male heirs. Only 2 daughters with and as the elder. In a world where women were considered property to be traded, inherited, or conquered, this was both an curse and her opportunity. The moment news of Francis's death reached the royal courts of Europe, the vultures began circling King Charles. The 8th of France, barely older than Anne herself, saw an opportunity to finally absorb Brittany into his growing empire. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian the Fair, and viewed her as a potential pawn in his endless chess game with France, meanwhile, and stood in her father's tomb, tears streaming down her face and knowing that powerful men were already drawing up marriage contracts with her name on them. The 13 and made her first desperate move in a secret ceremony that would have been considered treasonous by the French court. She married Maximilian, a mime by proxy. The emperor wasn't even present. A stand-in held Anne's trembling hand as she spoke vows to a man she'd never met in a language she barely understood. It was a political alliance masquerading as a marriage designed to give Brittany the protection of the Holy Roman Empire against French aggression. But Anne had underestimated the ruthlessness of teenage kings. Charles, an 8th of France, was not about to let his prize slip away to a Habsburg emperor. In 1491, French armies swept across Brittany like a plague of iron and fire. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, capturing fortress after fortress, cutting off supply lines and slowly tightening the noose around Diane's neck. Picture the scene. A 15-year-old girl standing on the battlements of Rennes, watching the French banners multiply on the horizon like a deadly rash. Her advisors speak in hushed, urgent tones behind her, but their words blur together into meaningless noise. The reality is stark and brutal. Brittany cannot win this war. The French have more men, more gold, more time, and proxy marriage to Maximilian has proven to be nothing more than a paper shield against a very real sword. The siege of Rennes lasted months inside the city. Food grew scarce, and I could hear the distant thunder of French cannons testing the walls. She must have wondered if Maximilian would come to her aid, if the promised armies of the Holy Roman Empire would appear on the horizon like salvation. They never came. In the game of European politics, Anne was discovering that promises made to teenage girls were worth less than the parchment they were written on. By winter, the choice was clear. Surrender or watch her people starve, and chose surrender. But Charles, the 8th terms were savage. Not only would she have to renounce her marriage to Maximilian, but she would have to marry Charles himself the Conqueror, demanding the conquered as his bride. It was a pattern as old as warfare itself. On December 6, 1491, I stood in the Cathedral of Langeais, her hands shaking as she placed them in Charles's. She was barely 16 and he was 21. The ceremony was magnificent. Cloth of gold, precious stones, hundreds of witnesses. But Anne's eyes were hollow. She was signing the death warrant of Britain, independence, and she knew it. The marriage contract was particularly cruel. It stipulated that if Charles died before and she would be required to marry his successor, she wasn't just becoming a queen. She was becoming a hereditary asset of the French crown to be passed from one king to the next like a prized jewel. The girl who had once stood defiantly in the towers of Nantes was now legally forbidden from ever escaping French control. The wedding night was a study in royal brutality disguised as ceremony. Charles, barely out of his teens himself, was not known for his gentleness and raised in the comparative freedom of Britain. Court culture was unprepared for the harsh realities of French royal marriage. What happened in the ornate bedchamber at Langeais was not love. It was conquest in its most intimate form. But Anne was stronger than anyone imagined. Within months, she was pregnant. The French court celebrated an heir to secure the union of Brittany in France and must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Hope that this child might give her some measure of power. Fear for what? Carrying a conqueror's child meant for her soul and the devastating knowledge that she was now trapped forever. The child was born dead. This would become the pattern of Anne's life. Hope followed by crushing loss. Pregnancy followed by grief. In the medieval world, infant mortality was common, but Anne's losses were extraordinary even by the standards of the time. She would endure at least 14 documented pregnancies, with most ending in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. Imagine the psychological toll. Each pregnancy brought the possibility of securing her position of giving France the heir it desperately wanted, of proving her worth. In a world that measured royal women by their ability to produce sons, each loss was not just personal grief, but political failure. Another mark against her in the ruthless ledger of royal expectations. Charles, meanwhile, was proving to be as ineffective as a ruler as he was cruel as a husband. He became obsessed with his claim to the throne of Naples, spending vast sums on Italian military campaigns while neglecting the governance of his own kingdom, and found herself effectively ruling France, while Charles played at being a conqueror in foreign lands. It was during one of these Italian adventures that fate intervened in the most unexpected way. In 1498, Charles VIII was walking through the galleries of Château d'Amboise when he struck his head on a low doorway. He collapsed immediately and died within hours. The king, who had forced him into marriage, was dead at 27, leaving behind no surviving children and was free, but only for a moment. According to the terms of her marriage contract, she was now required to marry Charles's successor, Louis XII. But Louis presented a problem. He was already married to Joan of France, the daughter of Louis the Levens. The solution was typically medieval in its cynical efficiency. Louis would seek an annulment from the Pope, claiming his marriage to Joan was invalid. The annulment process was a masterpiece of royal manipulation. Louis claims that Joan was physically deformed and unable to consummate their marriage despite the fact that they had been married for 20 years. Joan, a pious woman who had never done anything but serve her husband faithfully, was dragged through public humiliation. As intimate details of her body of their marriage were debated by church lawyers and watched this proceeding with growing horror, she was seeing her own future played out in Joan's present. Royal women were not people, but problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, resources to be redistributed. When Joan was finally cast aside and sent to a convent, I knew she was staring at her own potential fate. But Anne had learned something during her first marriage. She had discovered that even trapped queens could wield power if they were clever enough. When Louis XII came to claim her as his bride and surprised everyone by negotiating, she agreed to marry Louis, but this time she demanded concession. Brittany would retain certain autonomous privileges. She would have a say in the succession if they had children. Most importantly, she secured a promise that if Louis died before her, she would not be forced to marry his successor. She would be free to choose her own fate. The negotiations were a masterclass in royal diplomacy. and now 22 and hardened by years of loss of betrayal. Face down, the most powerful king in Europe, and extracted promises that should have been impossible for a woman in her position to obtain. She had learned to use her value as a political asset to carve out small spaces of autonomy within the prison of royal marriage. The wedding, held in 1499, was a far different affair from her first, and was no longer the terrified teenager who had trembled before Charles VIII. She was a queen who had buried children, ruled a kingdom, and survived the machinations of European politics. When she placed her hand in Louis, it was not surrender but negotiation. Louis XII proved to be a different kind of husband than Charles had been, where Charles was brutal and impulsive. Louis was calculating and patient. He understood that and was not just a wife but a political partner whose cooperation was essential to his reign. Their marriage, while still fundamentally coercive, developed into something resembling mutual respect, and threw herself into a new role with fierce determination. She established a court culture that blended French sophistication with Breton traditions, created patronage networks that extended her influence throughout the kingdom, and began the delicate work of ensuring that Brittany retained its unique identity, even within the French realm. But the ghosts of her lost children haunted every moment. Each pregnancy brought hope and terror in equal measure. She had learned to manage her expectations to prepare for loss, even as she prayed for success. The psychological armor she had developed was impressive, but heartbreaking. A woman who had trained herself not to hope too much for her own children. In 1501, and gave birth to a daughter, Claude. The child lived, thrived, and became the light of Annie's life for the first time in years, and experienced the joy of successful motherhood. But even this happiness was tinged with political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the son France desperately needed. And subsequent pregnancies followed the familiar pattern of loss. Sons who lived only days, daughters who never drew breath. The endless cycle of hope and grief that defined royal motherhood in an age of primitive medicine and political pressure. Each loss was both personal tragedy and state crisis. Another failure in Anne's primary duty as queen. The political implications of these losses were enormous. Without a male heir, the succession remained uncertain, and failure to produce sons was seen as a divine judgment, a sign that perhaps the union of Brittany and France was not blessed by God. Courtiers whispered foreign. Ambassadors sent coded messages to their masters and felt the weight of an entire kingdom's future pressing down on her shoulders. But Anne had learned to find power in unexpressed places. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning works that celebrated Britain culture and history. She established schools and hospitals, creating institutions that would outlast her own life. She carefully managed her daughter Claude's education, ensuring that the girl would be prepared for the brutal realities of royal life. In 1514, after 15 years of marriage to Louis XII and faced her greatest test, Louis, now 52 and in poor health, was contemplating remarriage after Anne's death to secure the succession. The king, who had promised to honor their marriage contract, was already making contingency plans that would undo everything and had fought for. Amdi's response was swift and decisive. She arranged for Claude to be betrothed to Francis of Angoulême-Louise, heir presumptive. It was a brilliant political move by ensuring that Claude would marry the next king and was securing both her daughter's future and Brittany's continued connection to the French throne. If Anne couldn't produce sons, she would at least ensure that her daughter's sons would rule. But the effort exhausted her years of political maneuvering. Repeated pregnancies and the constant stress of royal life had taken their toll, and health began to fail. In the winter of 1513, she was only 36, but she had lived several lifetimes' worth of tragedy and struggle as she lay dying in the Château de Blois, and must have reflected on the impossibility of her situation. She had been forced to marry 3 times, had endured 14 pregnancies, had watched most of her children die, and had sacrificed the homeland's independence on the altar of political necessity. Yet she had also negotiated unprecedented autonomy for a royal woman who preserved elements of Breton culture and had secured her daughter's future. The irony was profound, and who had spent her life being passed from one husband to another, who had been treated as property rather than person, had somehow managed to become one of the most powerful women in European history. She had learned to work within the system that oppressed her, to find agency in the midst of subjugation, to protect what she could while accepting what she couldn't change, and died on January 9, 1514, at the age of 36. Her last words were reported to be a prayer for Brittany, a final acknowledgement of the homeland. She had been forced to sacrifice. The girl who had once stood in the towers of Nanks watching enemy armies approach had become a queen who shaped the destiny of nations even as she was shaped by forces beyond her control. The funeral was magnificent, befitting a queen who had ruled 2 kingdoms and influenced the fate of Europe. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the common people of Brittany, who lined the roads as her body made its final journey. They remembered her not as the queen who had married their conquerors, but as the daughter who had tried to save them, who had preserved what she could of their culture and identity. But to truly understand the magnitude of Anne's tragedy and triumph, we need to delve deeper into the moments that shaped her. The intimate details of a life lived under impossible circumstances, the small rebellions that added up to something resembling freedom, and the cost of survival in a world that viewed women as nothing more than walking wombs and political assets. Let's return to that first wedding night at Largo in 1491 and 6. And trembling stood in the ornate bedchamber as servants prepared her for her duties as wife to Charles of VIII. The room was decorated with tapestries, depicting scenes of conquest. How grimly appropriate the bed itself was a monument to royal access. Carved with symbols of French power that must have felt like mockery to a girl who had just signed away her homeland independence. What the official chronicles don't tell you is the Anne wept, not the delicate tears of a romantic bride, but the raw, desperate sobs of a prisoner who finally understands the full scope of her captivity. A ladies-in-waiting, themselves products of aristocratic marriages arranged for political gain, offered what comfort they could. But what comfort could there be, and was about to be initiated into the most intimate form of conquest? And everyone in that room understood the reality behind the ceremonial pomp. Charles entered the chamber with the swagger of a young man who had never been denied anything he wanted. At 21, he was already showing signs of the physical and mental instability that would define his reign. His appearance was striking in all the wrong ways. A protruding jaw, a hooked nose, and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. This was the man who would father Anne's children, who would share her bed, who would have unlimited access to her body for the rest of his life. The consummation was brutal. Medieval marriage contracts were explicit about the need for witnesses to confirm that the union had been properly completed. And humiliation was not even private. The blood-stained sheets were displayed as proof of her virginity and the marriage's validity. A medieval trophy that reduced her most intimate moment to a matter of state record. But I learned something crucial that night. Survival required a kind of internal fortification that had nothing to do with castle walls or armies. She discovered that she could separate her mind from her body, that she could endure what could not be changed while preserving some essential core of herself that remained untouchable. It was a skill that would serve her well in the years to come. The early months of her marriage to Charles were a masterclass in royal humiliation. The French court, flush with victory over Brittany, treated him like a prized captive rather than a queen. Courtiers would bow to her face and snicker behind her back, making jokes about the Breton there and placing bets on how long it would take her to produce an heir, and endured the slights with outward grace. But inside, she was cataloging every insult, every slight, every moment of disrespect. She was learning the true cost of conquest, not just the loss of political independence, but the systematic destruction of personal dignity. Her first pregnancy came quickly. As was expected, the French court celebrated with premature enthusiasm, already planning the christening of the prince, who would cement the union of Brittany and France. Her, meanwhile, was experiencing the peculiar mixture of hope and terror that would characterize all her pregnancies. Would this child be her salvation or her doom with motherhood? Give her power or simply provide another weapon for her enemies to use against her? The pregnancy was difficult from the start and suffered from persistent nausea, debilitating headaches, and a strange sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake the court. Physicians, men who understood politics better than medicine, assured everyone that these were normal symptoms. Signs of a strong child growing in her womb. Brown's body was telling her something different. She lost the baby in her 6th month. The child was born, just developed enough for everyone to see that it would have been the son France desperately needed, and held the tiny, perfectly formed body in her arms. This prince, who would never rule this child who had died before, drawing a single breath. The grief was overwhelming, but what made it unbearable was the immediate shift in how she was treated. The moment the child's death was confirmed and transformed from precious vessel to potential problem, the whispers started immediately. Was she coerced? Was God punishing France for something? Was she capable of bearing healthy children at all? Charles's reaction was telling. He showed no grief for the lost child, no concern, friends, physical or emotional well-being. Instead, he immediately began calculating when she would be ready to conceive again. The baby was barely cold when discussions began about how to optimize Anne's next pregnancy. She realized with stunning clarity that she was not a wife who'd lost a child, but a failed breeding project that needed to be recalibrated. The second pregnancy came within months. Arm's body had barely recovered from the first loss when she found herself expecting again. This time she was determined to do everything perfectly. She followed every recommendation of the physicians, every superstition of the midwives, every prayer suggested by the priests. She ate foods that were supposed to encourage male children, slept in positions that were believed to prevent miscarriage, and wore amulets that promised divine protection for her pregnancy. None of it mattered. The second child lived only 3 days and held her dying son as his breathing grew shallow, watching the life fade from his eyes while courtiers already whispered about what his death meant for the succession. She realized that she was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening condemned to endure. Pregnancy after pregnancy, loss after loss, with each failure making her more vulnerable to the political machinations of those who saw her as an obstacle to be removed. The pattern established itself with horrifying regularity fragments. See hope, loss, blame, and the immediate pressure to conceive again, and body became a battleground where the future of nations was fought, and she was losing every battle. The physical toll was enormous. Constant pregnancy and miscarriage left her weak, anemic, and prematurely aged. But the psychological damage was perhaps worse. She was developing a kind of protective numbness, a way of experiencing hope without fully believing in it, of preparing for loss, even as she prayed for success. Charles, meanwhile, was proving to be as incompetent as a king as he was callous as a husband. His obsession with the Italian wars consumed vast resources and attention, leaving France's internal affairs to be managed by others, and found herself stepping into the void, managing correspondence, meeting with ministers, and making decisions that should have been Charles's responsibility. It was ironic she was gaining real political power just as her personal life was becoming a catalogue of losses. The Italian campaigns also provided, and with some respite from the relentless pressure to conceive. When Charles was away playing soldier, she could focus on governance rather than pregnancy. These periods of relative freedom gave her glimpses of what she might have been capable of if she had been born male, or if she had lived in a different era. She proved to be a skilled administrator, a thoughtful policymaker, and a capable diplomat. But these achievements were always overshadowed by her primary duty. Producing an heir for France in relationship with Charles was complex and evolving. She never loved him. How could she love the man who had conquered her homeland and forced her into marriage? But she learned to work with him, to manipulate him when necessary, and to find ways to advance her own agenda within the constraints of their relationship. She discovered that Charles, despite his cruelty, was also deeply insecure and dependent on her in ways he didn't fully understand. This gave her leveraged small spaces where she could exercise, influence, and protect what mattered to her. One of the most significant acts of subtle rebellion was her patronage of Breton culture. While she could not prevent the political absorption of Brittany into France, she could ensure that Breton traditions, language, and customs were preserved and celebrated. She commissioned works of art that depicted Breton history, supported scholars who studied Breton literature, and maintained a court culture that honored her homeland's heritage. These might seem like small gestures, but they were acts of cultural resistance that helped preserve Breton identity for future generations, and also began to build networks of female power that transcended traditional political boundaries. She corresponded with other queens and noble women across Europe, sharing information, offering support, and creating informal alliances that operated outside the male-dominated diplomatic sphere. These relationships provided her with both practical advantages and emotional sustenance. During the darkest periods of her life, the death of Charles VIII in 1498 was both liberation and fresh trauma for, and she was finally free from a marriage that had brought her nothing but pain. But she immediately faced the prospect of another forced union lose the tools. Pursuit of an annulment from his wife Joan, was a stark reminder that royal marriages were business transactions, not personal relationships, and watched Joan's public humiliation with a mixture of sympathy and terror, knowing that she was seeing her own potential future played out in real time, but was no longer the terrified 16-year-old who had been dragged to the altar at length. She was now 22, hardened by years of loss and political maneuvering. And she had learned to use her value as a political asset to extract concessions from those who sought to use her. Her negotiations with Louis XII were a masterpiece of strategic thinking, proof that she had transformed from victim to player in the game of European politics. The terms she negotiated were unprecedented for a woman in her position. She secured guarantees about Brittany's autonomy provisions for her own financial security, and most importantly, a promise that if Louis died before her, she would not be forced to marry his successor. These concessions represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power within royal marriage, and had managed to carve out spaces of agency within a system designed to deny her any autonomy at all. Her second wedding to Louis XII in 1499 was a very different affair from her first, and entered this marriage not as a conquered prize, but as a negotiating partner who had secured terms that protected her interests. She was still being forced to marry against her will, but she had managed to impose her own conditions on the arrangement. It was a small victory, but in the context of her life, small victories were everything. Louis XII proved to be a very different kind of husband from Charles, the faith where Charles had been brutal and neglectful. Louis was calculating and attentive. He understood that home was not just a wife, but a political asset whose cooperation was essential to his success. The marriage, while still fundamentally coercive, developed into something resembling a working partnership. Louis treated Anne with a respect that was born of pragmatism rather than affection. But it was still a vast improvement over her previous experience and threw herself into a new role with characteristic determination. She established a court that was both sophisticated and distinctly her own, blending French grandeur with Breton traditions in ways that honored both cultures. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning works that celebrated women's achievements and Breton heritage. She created charitable institutions that provided practical help to women and children, using her position to address problems that male rulers typically ignored. But the specter of pregnancy and loss continued to haunt her each time she conceived and faced the familiar mixture of hope and dread. She had learned to manage her expectations, to prepare for disappointment, even as she prayed for success. The Alma she had developed was psychologically necessary, but heartbreaking. A woman who had trained herself not to hope too much for her own children because hope made the losses unbearable. The birth of Claude in 1501 was a moment of pure joy and life. After years of losses, she finally had a child who lived, who thrived, who brought light into the darkness of her existence. But even this happiness was complicated by political reality. Claude was a daughter, not the son France needed, and knew that her failure to produce a male heir would continue to be held against her arms. Relationship with Claude was intense and complex. She was determined to prepare her daughter for the realities of royal life while protecting her from the worst aspects of Anne's own experience. She supervised Claude's education personally, ensuring that the girl learns not just the traditional feminine accomplishments, but also the political skills she would need to survive in a world that saw women as pawns in masculine games of power. The ongoing cycle of pregnancy and loss continued to define Anne's life. Each miscarriage was both personal tragedy and political crisis, another failure in her primary duty as queen. The physical toll was enormous. Anne's health deteriorated under the strain of constant pregnancy and loss, but perhaps more devastating was the psychological impact. She was living in a state of perpetual grief, never fully recovering from one loss before, facing the possibility of another. And final years were marked by a desperate race against time. She knew that her own health was failing, and she was determined to secure her daughter's future before it was too late. Her arrangement of Claude's betrothal to Francis of Angoulême was a stroke of political genius. By ensuring that Claude would marry the next king and was protecting both her daughter's position and the interests of Brittany, it was a masterpiece of long-term strategic thinking, the culmination of years of careful political maneuvering. The irony of Anne's death was profound. She had spent her entire adult life being passed from one husband to another, treated as property rather than person. Forced to endure pregnancy after pregnancy in service of political goals she had never chosen. Yet she had somehow managed to become one of the most powerful women in European history. Someone who had shaped the destiny of nations, even as she was shaped by forces beyond her control, and legacy is complex and multi-layered. She failed in her primary duty as defined by her era. She never produced the male heir that France desperately needed, but she succeeded in preserving elements of Breton culture and advancing the cause of women as education and welfare, and in creating a template for how royal women could exercise agency within systems designed to deny them power. She transformed from victim to survivor to someone who found ways to protect what mattered most, even when everything else was lost. The young girl who had stood in the tower at Nantes watching enemy armies approach could never have imagined the life that awaited her. But perhaps she would have recognized the strength it took to survive such a life. The courage required to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Anne of Brittany was indeed a child queen forced to marry her executioner. But she was also something more, a woman who discovered that even in the darkest circumstances there are always small spaces where hope can flourish, where love can exist, where the human spirit can find ways to endure and even triumph. Her story reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles and grand political movements. It's also about individuals caught in circumstances beyond their control. People who find ways to preserve what they can while they can, who discover that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that no one else even notices. And saved what she could of her world. And in doing so, she saved something essential about what it means to be human in the face of impossible odds. The wind still blows through the towers of Nantes, carrying the salt, scent of the sea, and the whispered stories of those who came before. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of a young girl's voice, defiant and determined, promising that some things, love, hope, the memory of who we were, will endure long after the armies have passed and the conquerors have turned to dust. And daughter Claude would go on to marry Francis I and become Queen of France, continuing the line that would rule for centuries. But Claude's path was remarkably different from her mother's. She enjoyed the relative freedom that came from marrying by choice rather than conquest, from entering a union that was political but not coercive. The cycle of forced marriage and political subjugation that defined man's life was finally broken by Anne herself, through her careful planning and fierce negotiations. She had ensured that her daughter would have choices that Anne herself had never been allowed to make. Standing in that tower at Nantes, watching the armies approach, 12-year-old and could never have imagined the life that awaited her. She could never have foreseen that she would be forced to marry her conqueror, that she would bury child after child, that she would become the most powerful woman in France, even as she remained trapped by the very system that elevated her. But perhaps she would have recognized the strength it took to survive such a life. Perhaps she would have understood that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is not resistance, but persistence, not the dramatic gesture, but the quiet determination to protect what you can while you can. And if Brittany was indeed a child queen, forced to marry her executioner, but she was also something more, a woman who discovered that even in the darkest circumstances, even within the most restrictive systems, there are always small spaces where agency can flourish, where love can exist, where hope can survive. The girl in the tower became the woman who saved what she could of her world. You transformed conquest into negotiation. You turned survival into a form of victory in the end. Perhaps that's the most any of us can hope for. To face the forces that would destroy us and find ways to preserve what matters most, even when everything else is lost. The wind still blows through the towers of Nuns, carrying the salt, scent of the sea, and the whispered stories of those who came before. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of a young girl's voice, defiant and determined, promising that some things, love, hope, the memory of who we were, will endure long after the armies have passed and the conquerors have turned to dust.